In the winter of 1841, residents of Philadelphia's Kensington district began reporting the eerie sight of a young girl wandering barefoot through the snow at dawn, her steps leaving trails of blood that formed strange patterns across the frozen streets. Barely 8 years old, she would stand motionless for hours outside the Pennsylvania hospital, her gaze fixed on the massive brick walls as her lips moved soundlessly as if repeating words from memory. When approached, she spoke in chillingly precise medical terms, describing surgical procedures with knowledge no child could possess, leaving even seasoned men pale and unsettled. City records uncovered a century later during a 1943 renovation revealed 37 official reports of this strange figure, yet none were ever investigated. Each was marked with the cryptic note, "Medical discretion advised." The girl's name was Sarah Montgomery, and the truth about her fate inside Philadelphia's most prestigious medical institution remained locked away for generations. What happened to Sarah was not just a local mystery, but part of a much larger story the medical establishment of the 1840s worked tirelessly to bury. Philadelphia, in that era, stood as the medical capital of America, home to more medical schools per capita than any other city, and host to physicians whose research outpaced their peers in Boston, New York, and Baltimore combined. The Pennsylvania Hospital, founded by Benjamin Franklin, was a beacon of progress, but also a place where progress came at a terrible cost. There were no ethics committees, no concept of informed consent, and no laws to protect the vulnerable from becoming test subjects in the pursuit of knowledge. Immigrants flooding Kensington lived in dire poverty, crammed into filthy tenements where cholera and industrial accidents ravaged families. Children often disappeared into orphanages, never to return. In this environment, destitute families became the easiest prey for ambitious doctors, eager to test procedures too dangerous for patients of influence or means. Among them was Dr. Cornelius Thorne, a physician who built his reputation on controversial treatments for what he called hysteria, nervous disorders, and melancholia conditions, ranging from simple depression to profound psychological trauma. In Sarah Montgomery's case, Thorne and others saw more than just a patient. They saw opportunity. Dr. Cornelius Thorne's private practice on Walnut Street operated out of a grand 4-story townhouse that had once belonged to a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Behind its polished doors, Philadelphia's wealthiest families paid enormous sums for his pioneering treatments, mercury compounds shipped from European mines, opium derivatives refined in his own laboratory, and electric stimulation devices he had personally designed after studying experimental equipment in London and Paris. His reputation was international. Thorne's articles in the American Journal of Medical Sciences drew acclaim, and physicians from Vienna to Edinburgh traveled across the Atlantic to watch his work. His preserved correspondence, still housed in the archives of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, reveals a man unflinching in his conviction that true medical progress demanded sacrifices. In one chilling letter to Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of Heidelberg, Thorne wrote, "The advancement of medical science requires a willingness to explore territories that conventional morality might consider forbidden. Our oath is to healing. But healing on a grand scale sometimes demands sacrifices that individuals cannot understand." Yet questions lingered over the origin of his extensive case studies on childhood psychological disorders, research requiring dozens of young subjects for long periods of time. Wealthy families were unlikely to offer their children up for risky experiments, leaving only one possible source, the city's poorest and most powerless. Sarah Montgomery's parents, Bridget and Seamus, arrived in Philadelphia in September 1840 aboard the Celtic Dawn. They carried little more than their daughter, a few belongings wrapped in oiled cloth, and the fragile hope of escaping Ireland's famine-driven poverty that had already claimed much of their family. In Philadelphia, Seamus endured suffocating labor in textile mills along the Schuylkill River. his lungs filling with cotton fibers that slowly destroyed his health. Bridget worked as a washerwoman for affluent households in Society Hill, her hands raw and bleeding from the icy winter water. The family rented a cramped room in a Kensington boarding house owned by Agnes Kellerman, a German immigrant who meticulously documented every tenant occupations, illnesses, debts, and family ties. Her careful notes would later become crucial evidence in understanding the systematic exploitation of immigrant children in Philadelphia. The winter of 1840, Chapter 41, was one of the harshest in decades. Snow buried the unpaved streets, and disease tore through overcrowded neighborhoods. Seamus's cough worsened into what we now know as pneumoconiosis, or brown lung disease. As his condition deteriorated, medical bills mounted. Physicians often charged immigrants double their usual rates, preying on families with no alternatives. Like thousands of desperate parents, the Montgomerys faced a grim choice: surrender their child to one of the city's so-called charitable institutions, which promised food, shelter, and education in exchange for guardianship. In reality, these institutions often funneled children directly into the hands of physicians, conducting experimental research where there was no oversight, no accountability, and no escape. On January 15, 1841, Agnes Kellerman made her morning rounds through the boarding house. When she reached the Montgomerys' room, she found it empty. Sarah's few belongings, a rag doll stitched from scraps of Irish wool, a small wooden cross that had belonged to her grandmother, and the dress she had worn across the ocean, were gone. On the rough wooden table lay a single note written in an elegant, educated hand that no working-class immigrant could have penned. Preserved in Kellerman's private papers and later donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, it read, "The child Sarah Montgomery has been placed in proper medical care for her own welfare and advancement. The family's outstanding debts for medical services rendered to Seamus Montgomery are hereby considered satisfied in full." The note left behind in the Montgomerys' empty room ended with a chilling line: "Further inquiries regarding this placement are neither necessary nor advisable." It bore an official-looking seal that claimed to represent the Philadelphia Medical Society. Yet no such organization appeared in any record directory or corporate filing of the period. The deception was deliberate. That morning, Bridget Montgomery's screams tore through the boarding house and spilled into the street, drawing neighbors from blocks away until constables were called to calm the chaos. Through tears, she told anyone who would listen that men in dark coats had entered during the night, whispering with her husband while she pretended to sleep. After they left, she had heard Seamus sobbing quietly. Later, she confessed that she and her husband had signed papers they couldn't read, clinging to the belief that their daughter would be educated and return to them once their fortunes improved. Their attempts to find Sarah led nowhere. Hospitals, orphanages, and churches all denied any record of her, dismissing the documentation Bridget carried as invalid. When she tried to file a missing person report, authorities coldly informed her that a child placed into medical care with parental consent could not be considered missing. Without money for legal representation, the Montgomerys found themselves powerless. What they did not know was that Sarah's disappearance was not the result of bureaucratic error, but the work of a hidden circle of physicians led by Cornelius Thorne. This clandestine organization, which its members called the Society for the Advancement of Neurological Science, thrived beneath the veneer of Philadelphia's medical prestige. Cloaked in secrecy, it acquired children from desperate immigrant families under the guise of charity and education, transforming them into unwilling test subjects. Thorne and his colleagues sought to map and manipulate the developing human mind, experimenting with trauma narcotics and invasive procedures. They described as cognitive restructuring. The society operated with precision. Intermediaries targeted struggling families, legal representatives drafted convincing but meaningless paperwork, and the children were taken to hidden facilities far from the scrutiny of legitimate hospitals. Chief among these was a repurposed warehouse near the Philadelphia port, outwardly registered to a shell company known as the Delaware Medical Supply Company. Behind its boarded windows and crumbling facade, the basement had been rebuilt into a secret laboratory. There were surgical suites, pharmaceutical workrooms, and locked quarters that imitated children's bedrooms, each fitted with concealed observation slits. It was here in January of 1841 that Sarah Montgomery was delivered and recorded in Thorne's journals as Subject S41. The initial notes described her as a healthy 8-year-old with normal development, no signs of mental illness, and a remarkable gift for memory and learning. This ability drew Thorne's obsessive interest, marking her as a prime candidate for his most ambitious work, what he termed accelerated cognitive restructuring, a program designed to push the human mind beyond its natural limits through controlled trauma and chemical intervention. His leather-bound journals detailed every administered dose of mercury laudanum and other substances, every induced state of fear or stress, and every measurable shift in Sarah's responses. The basement where Sarah Montgomery and other children were confined embodied Cornelius Thorne's ultimate vision, a perfectly controlled environment where no outside influence could taint his results. Every detail had been engineered to serve his experiments. Thickly padded walls absorbed sound, sealing in the cries of his subjects. Artificial lighting was rigged to break natural sleep cycles, while an intricate ventilation system allowed chemical vapors to be pumped in at will, altering mood perception and consciousness during conditioning sessions. As the weeks passed after Sarah's disappearance, unsettling stories began to ripple through Philadelphia's medical district. At first dismissed as hysteria, the consistency of the accounts hinted at something far more sinister. Night orderlies at Pennsylvania Hospital whispered of hearing children's voices drifting from the basement's areas, supposedly used only for storage. The voices spoke not in childish rambling, but in precise clinical descriptions of anatomy and surgery, as though rehearsing lessons far beyond their years. Nurses stumbled upon surgical instruments arranged in eerie patterns. Scalpels lined up like toy soldiers, forceps, spelling out letters of the alphabet, bandages tied into intricate knots, resembling games no child should know. Medical students, exhausted from their grueling studies, reported fleeting glimpses of a small girl in the lecture halls, always on the edge of their vision. She scribbled notes with unnerving accuracy, sometimes even correcting professors' mistakes. But when they turned to look directly, she was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of mercury and laudanum, the unmistakable markers of Thorne's treatments. Faculty dismissed the stories as hallucinations born of fatigue. Yet the identical descriptions of a pale girl with aged eyes suggested something far more disturbing. Meanwhile, Thorne's private research advanced with chilling precision. His experimental logs, encrypted in a blend of Latin terminology and numerical codes, charted Sarah's decline with the detached exactness of a man dissecting a laboratory specimen, rather than tending to a child. His methodology followed a rigid progression he had refined through years of illicit trials on adult subjects, first establishing baseline behaviors through observation, then introducing mercury compounds to map their neurological effects, followed by opium derivatives to test pain thresholds and heighten psychological pliability. Finally, Thorne combined these substances to engineer what he called controllable associative states, a rudimentary form of programming in which subjects could be conditioned to respond to specific triggers in predictable ways. Sarah's transformation haunted his notes. At first, she resisted crying for her parents, trembling in fear, clawing for escape. But as the experiments deepened, her responses shifted. The drugs and conditioning carved away her natural defenses, reshaping her mind in ways Thorne had scarcely dared to imagine. Instead of breaking completely, she adapted. Her memory sharpened her, learning accelerated, and her behavior began aligning with the patterns Thorne had designed. To him, this was proof that his theories were correct. To history, it remains a grotesque example of science, without conscience, recorded in pages that read more like instructions for breaking the human soul than advancing medicine. Within 6 weeks of arriving at the hidden facility, Sarah Montgomery had become something far more than a frightened child. She could recite advanced anatomical terminology with flawless precision, identify surgical instruments by touch alone, and describe medical procedures with an accuracy that left even Thorne's most seasoned colleagues unsettled. But it was her disturbing ability to detach from her own pain, what Thorne called empathic dissociation, that truly fascinated him. She could endure excruciating procedures while analyzing her suffering with a cold, clinical clarity, as though observing herself from a distance, yet still remained fully conscious of the agony being inflicted. To Thorne, she was proof that his theories could reshape the human mind. Back in Kensington, Mrs. Agnes Kellerman refused to accept Sarah's disappearance as an isolated tragedy. Haunted by memories of the medical abuses she had witnessed in Prussian prisons, she began a meticulous investigation. Every conversation with officials, every contradiction in their statements, every failed attempt to trace Sarah was written down in her journals. What she uncovered was horrifying. Sarah's abduction was not unique. Over the past 3 years, dozens of immigrant families had reported the same pattern. Polished men in fine coats promised education and medical care. Papers were signed papers the parents couldn't read, and the children vanished, leaving no trace in any official record. Her suspicions were confirmed by a growing list of names. The Flanagan boy, age 7, disappeared after his parents were convinced to sign enrollment forms for a prestigious boarding school. The Kowalski twins, 9 and 10, vanished after being taken for what was promised to be a short medical evaluation. The Riley girl, only 6, never returned after her mother was persuaded that experimental treatments could cure her nightmares. Each time the families were desperate, each time the promises seemed irresistible, and each time the contracts they signed quietly stripped them of their parental rights. Inside the warehouse, Thorne had constructed a grotesque imitation of a hospital and school, complete with surgical suites, research libraries, and lecture rooms. Here, the children were reshaped into both patients and participants. They were trained to observe each other's examinations, record symptoms with scientific precision, and maintain emotional detachment while watching procedures that would have horrified even medical professionals. Compliance was rewarded with food, warm clothing, and books, along with the carefully dangled promise that cooperation would lead to reunions with their families. Many came to believe they were privileged contributors to vital medical progress rather than captives in an elaborate system of exploitation. Thorne's journals revealed his satisfaction at this transformation, noting how effectively the children's loyalty could be redirected from their families to the authority of the institution. By the spring of 1841, his work had reached a dangerous new stage. Philadelphia's elite, emerging from their winter retreats and resuming the city's glittering social season, began to seek Thorne's expertise for their own children. They brought him cases of disobedience, melancholy, and academic struggles, ailments for which conventional medicine offered little hope. What these families could not imagine was that the techniques Thorne used on their sons and daughters had been perfected on kidnapped immigrant children hidden in a warehouse basement, their suffering transmuted into knowledge that now passed as legitimate medical advancement. The irony was never lost on Cornelius Thorne. The very techniques that shattered the minds of children like Sarah Montgomery were now being requested at handsome prices by Philadelphia's wealthiest families. He delivered gentler, sanitized versions of his methods to treat their sons and daughters, even as his private notes revealed the torment of a man torn between ambition and conscience. In a letter to his closest collaborator, Dr. Edmund Hartwell, Thorne admitted, "I find myself in the peculiar position of healing the children of those who would condemn me if they knew the source of my knowledge." Yet science advances through sacrifice. If the suffering of a few can alleviate the suffering of many, can we not justify the methods by the outcomes? Sarah had by then become his most prized and most unsettling subject. Under relentless chemical dosing and psychological conditioning that would today be recognized as systematic torture, she developed what Thorne described as adaptive dissociation. In practice, this meant she could switch between entirely different states of being. During experiments, she transformed into a detached observer, calmly documenting her own reactions, suggesting modifications to procedures, and even engaging in clinical debate with her captors. When the sessions ended, she shifted back into a childlike persona. But even her play seemed hollow, more performance than reality, as though she knew she was imitating the idea of childhood rather than living it. By spring of 1841, nearly 15 children were confined in Thorne's hidden facility, and even they sensed something unnatural about Sarah. They could not explain their fear, only that she anticipated Thorne's experiments with an uncanny foresight and participated in ways no child should. She comforted younger children as they suffered, whispering reassurances while simultaneously recording their responses with chilling precision. To Thorne's hardened assistants, her behavior blurred the line between victim and collaborator, an unsettling mirror of their own roles in the cruelty. It was Hartwell who first began to falter. Letters later discovered among his estate reveal his growing unease. In one dated April 3, 1841, he confided to his brother in Boston, "The Montgomery child has developed capacities that suggest our interventions have altered her neurological development in ways we did not anticipate and cannot control. She learns at a rate surpassing our most advanced students. Yet her emotions swing between artificial childishness and a detachment that rivals our own clinical manner. I fear we have created something that neither medicine nor compassion can comprehend, and I question whether knowledge can justify the damage we have wrought." While doubt crept into Hartwell's mind, pressure from outside the medical world began to mount. Reform-minded citizens, stirred by whispers of missing immigrant children, started piecing together troubling patterns. Among them was Rebecca Stanwood, a young Quaker whose family had long been active in the abolitionist cause. She brought the same relentless moral energy to the plight of lost children. Long before formal child protection societies existed, Stanwood compiled meticulous records of disappearances in Kensington. She mapped out patterns, interviewed grieving families, and carefully cataloged the evasions and contradictions offered by city officials. Her work began to reveal not isolated tragedies, but a system, a machinery of abduction paperwork and silence that served to funnel immigrant children into the hands of physicians like Thorne. What she uncovered hinted at more than medical abuse. It pointed toward institutional corruption that shielded and enabled the trade in vulnerable lives. Rebecca Stanwood's careful record-keeping eventually led her straight to Agnes Kellerman, whose knowledge of German and other European dialects made her indispensable in speaking with families who lacked English fluency and feared approaching officials. Together, the two women began cross-referencing disappearances, charting them across neighborhoods, ethnic groups, and timelines. The patterns became undeniable. Every missing child came from a family on the brink of destitution. Every child had shown unusual aptitude, bright, quick learners, sometimes precociously so. Every case involved the same polished network of intermediaries, men in dark coats who promised education and medical care. And in every instance, parents were made to sign official-looking papers that effectively severed their rights, cloaked in language too complex for them to grasp. By the summer of 1841, Thorne's hidden facility had swelled to nearly 20 children between the ages of 6 and 12. What had once been a basement laboratory now resembled a grim parody of an institution, crude surgical theaters, a pharmacy stocked for endless trials. record-keeping stations, and dormitories stripped of any resemblance to childhood comfort. Thorne's research had shifted from drug trials to what he described as behavioral modification through controlled trauma. His methods relied on cycles of pain and psychological pressure, breaking down natural resistance while training the children to absorb and retain advanced concepts at unnatural speed. Life inside the warehouse followed a strict regimen. Mornings were devoted to academics, reading, writing, arithmetic, all reshaped to emphasize medical terminology that would serve their roles as experimental subjects. Afternoons belonged to the experiments. The children rotated between roles, patient, observer, assistant. They learned to administer injections, measure vital signs, log symptoms with clinical detail, and even comfort each other during procedures, all while under the influence of drugs that blunted their natural emotional responses. Suffering became not only routine, but presented as essential a sacrifice for knowledge. Sarah Montgomery had become Thorne's greatest success and his most damning creation. Months of conditioning had transformed her into a child who could wield surgical instruments with precision, yet still play at being the comforting peer who calmed others into compliance. She was no longer just a subject, but an active participant in the system of abuse, her role expanding to include assessing new arrivals, helping prepare chemical compounds, and translating Thorne's instructions into language the younger children could understand. Most chillingly, she embodied what Thorne termed empathic detachment, a cultivated state that allowed her to genuinely soothe others while simultaneously recording their pain as data points. She was victim assistant and observer all at once, the very outcome Thorne had dreamed of achieving. The illusion of control collapsed in late July. That month, a new subject, a 6-year-old Polish boy named Stanisław Kowalich, was pushed into one of Thorne's threshold experiments trials that deliberately measured the lethal limits of toxins. Thorne had been escalating doses of mercury, carefully charting the progression toward inevitable collapse. Stanisław's death was not an accident. It was data. His symptoms were recorded with icy detachment, each convulsion and gasp noted alongside proposed refinements for future protocols. Sarah was there when he died. What followed rattled even Thorne. Instead of breaking down in grief or horror, Sarah examined the boy's body as if she were one of the attending physicians. She noted the sequence of his symptoms, asked incisive questions about the organ failures she had observed, and suggested methodological changes to minimize premature losses in future trials. Thorne's journal captures the moment with unnerving candor. Subject S41 has achieved a level of dissociative adaptation that exceeds our projections. The death of subject P17 produced responses suggesting complete fusion of clinical detachment and emotional processing. I question whether we have created a medical professional in the body of a child or something entirely new in human psychology. Dr. Edmund Hartwell's doubts hardened into resolve after the death of 6-year-old Stanisław Kowalich. For years, he had stood at Thorne's side, justifying each cruelty in the name of science. But the boy's agonizing end marked a line he could not cross. Quietly, he began building a second archive, not to advance medicine, but to expose a crime. By candlelight, he sketched the facility's rooms, copied Thorne's protocols, and risked detection by photographing the children's condition with primitive daguerreotype equipment. Most damning of all, he assembled comprehensive medical records that cataloged the scars, malnutrition, psychological collapse, and chemical damage inflicted on every child. Hartwell's hidden notes went beyond evidence. They outlined escape. He mapped the daily routines, recorded security rotations, and charted the best points of entry and exit. Through whispers in City Hall, he learned of an upcoming inspection of Philadelphia's warehouse district, prompted by fears of cholera near the port. Hartwell realized this was his moment. If the inspectors entered Thorne's hidden hospital with advocates by their side, The operation could not be buried. He contacted Rebecca Stanwood and Agnes Kellerman, arranging for them to be present that day, armed with documentation, family testimonies, and names of missing children. Together, they could force Philadelphia's political establishment, corrupt as it was to confront the truth. But Thorne was already spiraling into paranoia. He knew reformers were circling closer. His files showed blackmail material collected on city officials, contingency plans for burning records, even notes on disposing of witnesses. By August of 1841, his obsession with secrecy had consumed him. When he learned inspectors were approaching the port warehouses on the morning of August 3rd, he made his most desperate and horrifying choice. Rather than face exposure, he prepared to erase everything, including the children. In the surgical suites of the basement, he mixed massive doses of laudanum and mercury planning to inject every subject before the inspectors arrived. Their deaths would be staged as casualties of a cholera outbreak in his charitable clinic. Thorne envisioned himself recast as a martyr doctor to the poor who lost his patients to plague, despite heroic efforts to save them. In a single stroke, he would destroy the evidence and preserve his reputation. But Sarah Montgomery, 8 years old, and shaped into something unrecognizable by months of conditioning, saw through the ruse instantly. Her altered mind, trained to read Thorne's every preparation, recognized the lethal cocktail for what it was. She knew what he intended, and she knew the others would die unless she acted. The decision she made in that moment became the turning point, the act that ensured survival for the children, but condemned her to a fate more haunting than death. The surviving children would one day testify about what happened in those hours. Though for decades their words were dismissed as hallucinations born of trauma. Only when Hartwell's secret documents came to light were their stories vindicated. What Sarah did inside that basement, how? An 8-year-old transformed by cruelty into a hybrid of victim and collaborator, turned on her captor, remains one of the darkest and most extraordinary episodes in Philadelphia's hidden history. Sarah Montgomery's final confrontation with Dr. Cornelius Thorne was not the desperate struggle of a child against her tormentor, but a chilling inversion of power. Months of systematic conditioning had transformed her into something Thorne himself could not have predicted. An 8-year-old with the detached reasoning of a physician, the observational instincts of a scientist, and the fractured emotional needs of a child. As Thorne prepared the lethal injections meant to erase his crimes, Sarah approached him with the calm precision he had forced into her. In the same clinical language he had drilled into her psyche, she described step by step what his concoction of laudanum and mercury would do to the human body. Confusion, respiratory collapse, cardiac arrhythmia, death by suffocation. But then she went further, explaining with unnerving clarity why his plan would fail. She listed the forensic evidence investigators would uncover: the lingering opium odor, the telltale chemical burns, the distinctive symptoms that no cholera outbreak could mimic. She even reminded him that Mrs. Kellerman had already given investigators descriptions that would make the children's identification inevitable. For nearly an hour, the basement became a grotesque classroom. Sarah dismantled his plan with the clinical sharpness of a prosecutor, her words both analysis and indictment. She even offered him improvements on his scheme: alternative toxins disposal methods and cover stories delivered not with malice or hope of survival, but with the detached curiosity of someone treating mass murder as an intellectual exercise. The other children watched in paralyzed horror. To them, the most terrifying thing was not Thorne's syringe, but Sarah herself. She had become something inhuman, an echo of a child, hollowed out and rebuilt into a vessel of cold intellect and conditioned obedience. Some of the younger ones began to weep, not out of fear of dying, but out of despair that their friend was no longer entirely one of them. When the inspectors finally burst into the basement, the scene was frozen in macabre stillness. Thorne sat slumped in his chair, his face gray with shock, staring at the child who had outmaneuvered him. Sarah, unflinching, turned to the other children and calmly explained what would come next. The questions they would be asked, the confusion they might feel, because of the drugs, the answers they should give to minimize further harm. Rebecca Stanwood, who witnessed the rescue firsthand, later described the moment in her testimony. Some of the children broke down, sobbing, clinging to the adults who had come to free them. Others stared blankly, unable to process what was happening. But Sarah stood apart, speaking with the authority of someone far older, instructing the others on how to survive what lay ahead. It was as if the trauma of months in that basement had fractured time itself, leaving the children trapped in conflicting stages of development, some innocent and broken, others unnervingly composed, and one small girl whose transformation defied every human category. The children freed from the warehouse presented a scene so bewildering that the inspectors, reformers, and physicians who first encountered them struggled to put words to what they had seen. Some clung to adults and wept like the victims of ordinary cruelty, desperate for comfort, terrified of separation. Others, particularly those who had been held the longest, spoke in strange clinical phrases, reciting anatomical terminology and recording their experiences as though they were doctors rather than patients. Their emotions, when displayed at all, seemed rehearsed like roles they had learned to play, rather than feelings that came naturally. And then there was Sarah Montgomery. She existed outside every category the investigators could imagine. When questioned, she gave testimony like a trained medical observer, describing surgical procedures in exacting detail, mapping the layout of the facility from memory, and explaining Thorne's research methodologies in a language so technical that authorities had to consult practicing physicians to verify her accuracy. Yet, in the midst of these terrifyingly precise recitations, Sarah would suddenly regress. She would ask for her mother, cry over the loss of her doll, or cling to officials with the fragile desperation of the child she still was. It was as if two people inhabited her small frame, the innocent 8-year-old torn from Kensington and the clinical creation forged in Thorne's laboratory. Dr. Cornelius Thorne never faced a trial. Within 6 hours of the raid, he was discovered in his Walnut Street office dead from an apparent overdose of the very mercury compounds he had administered to children. His suicide note, written in the same cold language that filled his research journals, described Sarah as the most successful and most tragic outcome of our investigations into the malleability of human consciousness. It ended with a single haunting line: "Science demands sacrifices, but perhaps some knowledge is too terrible to possess." The scandal, quickly dubbed the Kensington Children Incident by the press, shook Philadelphia. For 6 weeks, newspapers carried lurid accounts, while reformers demanded accountability. Yet the official inquiry left everyone dissatisfied. Families were told that 11 children had been recovered, though witnesses swore nearly twice that number had been held in the warehouse. Several names on lists compiled by Stanwood and Kellerman were quietly dropped from the record, and those children were never seen again. The Philadelphia Medical Society disavowed Thorne entirely, insisting he had acted alone, despite evidence of correspondence funding and collaboration from respected physicians. City leaders promised reform, but few concrete measures followed. The survivors faced uneven futures. Some, particularly those who had been confined only briefly, returned to their families and eventually built lives in which the horrors of the warehouse became blurred, suppressed, or buried in memory. Others bore visible scars, difficulty learning erratic behavior, emotional instability that 1840s medicine could not comprehend, much less treat. Sarah Montgomery stood apart her case, confounding everyone who tried to make sense of her. Her parents, Bridget and Seamus, had crossed the Atlantic hoping to give their daughter a chance at life beyond Ireland's hunger and poverty. Instead, they found her returned to them, a stranger, an 8-year-old with the intellectual precision of a physician, the observational detachment of a scientist, and the fractured emotional world of a traumatized child. Doctors struggled to categorize her, priests struggled to comfort her, and her parents struggled simply to recognize her. The transformation inflicted on Sarah Montgomery was permanent. She would never again be only the child they had brought from Ireland, but something new and unsettling, an enduring reminder of how far human ambition can twist innocence when knowledge is pursued without conscience. Sarah Montgomery never forgot. Unlike other children whose memories blurred or fractured under trauma, she retained exact recall of her captivity. She could describe in unrelenting detail every procedure inflicted on herself and her companions. Her medical knowledge soon outstripped that of many trained physicians of her era, yet her social world remained stunted. She struggled to understand friendship, displayed confusion in even basic emotional interactions, and seemed incapable of separating empathy from clinical observation. To her, every human relationship became a case study, every expression of grief or affection another data point. Agnes Kellerman, whose tireless documentation had helped bring the truth to light, took a personal interest in Sarah's recovery. Drawing on her own memories of authoritarian abuses in Prussia, she saw in Sarah not just a victim, but a living example of what unchecked power in the name of science could produce. She organized a fund for the Montgomery family and other survivors, while working with Rebecca Stanwood to preserve records of the children's ordeal for future generations. Their careful work became some of the earliest evidence used by reformers advocating for oversight in medical research and protections for vulnerable populations. The revelations from the warehouse sent shockwaves through Philadelphia's medical establishment. Reformers called for ethical guidelines and legal safeguards, while entrenched physicians insisted that Thorne's atrocities were aberrations, not reasons to constrain progress. Heated debates followed, but in the end, little changed. Science pressed on, while the memory of what had been uncovered in Kensington slowly faded from public view. Sarah lived into adulthood, but the child her parents once knew was gone. She never married, never bore children, and never managed the kind of emotional intimacy most people take for granted. Instead, she carved out a strange place on the margins of medicine, quietly advising physicians on cases of unusual psychological complexity. Her insights were valued, yet she remained a figure of unease, her brilliance inseparable from the horrors that had created it. In her later years, Sarah began to write. The memoirs she produced, hundreds of pages of clear clinical recollections interwoven with the fractured voice of the child she had once been, were too disturbing for publication at the time. Hidden among the private papers of a Philadelphia physician, they came to light only in the 1920s, shocking historians with their first-hand account of early human experimentation and its devastating impact on developing minds. The warehouse itself did not survive long. Officially condemned for structural instability, it was demolished in 1847. Many suspected the true reason was to erase the physical remains of Thorne's crimes. Today, its site lies beneath a parking lot in northern Liberties, unremarkable, save for a small plaque installed by the Pennsylvania Historical Society in 1991, exactly 150 years after Sarah's rescue. Her story endures as a warning. The line between healing and harm, between research and exploitation, remains perilously thin. Sarah Montgomery's fate reminds us that knowledge pursued without conscience can exact costs too terrible to bear, and that the most vulnerable often pay the highest price for what others call progress. So what do you think? Was everything truly revealed about what happened in that basement, or do secrets still lie buried in Philadelphia's archives? If this tale has unsettled you, subscribe. Share it with someone who loves dark history, and join us as we continue uncovering the shadows that the past has tried to forget.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.